Okay, so now in this final part of the groups and teams set of videos, we're going to talk about group decision making and all of the downsides that are also related to coming together to make decisions in a group context. Now, when we are going through the decision making process in a group, we follow certain steps. The first of these is diagnosing the problem. So, understanding what the problem is, what is it that our group is facing. The next thing then is to generate solutions. So, we have a problem. Let's think about solutions to the problem. So let's imagine, for example, that you are working at Amazon and you find yourself having to deal with the grumblings of employees about the poor working conditions, particularly for warehouse workers. Well, you can start to then generate with a group of people some solutions to these issues. Maybe you treat employees better. Maybe you give them a living wage. Maybe you give them bonuses. Maybe you make them full-time employees sooner rather than making them part-time employees. So you generate a list of solutions and then you evaluate those solutions. You go about deciding which solutions have different consequences. How likely do you think you will have success versus failure? How easy are these solutions to implement, etc. Then you choose a solution, so you make a choice among those based on your evaluation, and then you develop an action plan and implement it. Let's say, for example, your plan is to um, just brush everything under the rug that's going on at Amazon, which for the record, I would never recommend and think is a terrible idea. Let's say at Amazon, you decide the easiest thing is to ignore the protestations and the complaints from your employees, and you implement it. You say, we're not going to acknowledge it because it's not a problem we care to deal with. That represents how groups can go about making decisions within organizations. But each of these steps has different things that come with it. And we're going to discuss a few of these steps in a little greater detail. So, as I said, the first step is diagnosing the problem. So, let's say that we have identified what a problem is. As I said, in this case, that Amazon is dealing with the grumblings and anger from its employees over the way they are treated. Well, the next step is to generate solutions. Now, there are a number of ways that we can do this. One way that people often go about generating solutions in groups is through brainstorming. This is where you do a lot of what I just said here, where you generate solutions, you evaluate them, and then you choose them. That's usually what takes place in a brainstorming session, though some people just focus on it as being part of this generating solutions without necessarily evaluating or choosing among them. So, brainstorming, though, can present a lot of problems, right? We've all been in brainstorming sessions where ego gets in the way or personality can sometimes prohibit the extent to which we can contribute or can even lead to, from the previous video, conflict. So, one of the ways that we can do this is to, or rather, build upon the brainstorming approach is something known as the nominal group technique. The nominal group technique, unlike brainstorming, is far more structured. This involves people within a group listing their ideas, people then reporting on and evaluating these ideas, and then voting privately on them. These days, the nominal group technique is more often done through computer assistance. So you do it through an anonymous chat room, for example. And in that way, you can actually report ideas anonymously and then evaluate them anonymously. So we don't have to ever worry about, well, so-and-so is just not going to like my idea because they don't like me, or I'm never going to like anything so-and-so says, so I'm always going to give it a poor rating. This way we can remove the impact as much as we can of personality, of conflict, or rather interpersonal conflict, and really capitalize on the different perspectives in a group. So those are some of the ways that we can generate solutions. But then we also have to choose a solution. According to your textbook, there are certain ways that we can choose a solution within a group. One way is through delegating. This is where you, as a group, give all the information and the different solutions you have come up with to one person, and that one person is responsible for choosing a solution. There are obviously some downsides to this. If we bring a group together, we would want them to be a part of choosing the solution and not just putting it off onto one person. So there are downsides to delegating. The upside too, though, is that there is some level of focused responsibility, namely the person who chooses the solution may bear more responsibility than the group. We can also average individual inputs. So where this is possible, which isn't possible with every type of solution you would be looking at, you can make a decision that's based on effectively the average of what everybody's recommending. So let's say you're part of a group that has to decide how many employees are laid off from a company. You may average the recommended number of all the members of the group, and that is the choice that you end up making. So if one person recommends 500, another person recommends 100, and another person recommends 300, you take the average of those, and that would get you to 300. Did the quick math there. I hope that's right. 300 people to lay off, that is. Then we can also do the majority rules, which we will revisit when we talk about consensus and whatnot in groupthink. But this is where you rely on the majority rules. So if we get over 50% of people in the group going with one course of action, that's the one we go with. And then the other one is group consensus. Now, this is different than majority rules. Majority just waits until we get a majority of people agreeing with a potential solution. So 50% or more, 50.1% or more. Group consensus, however, requires that everyone agrees. So whereas majority rules, we would only need to have, say, 3 out of 5 people agree with a particular solution. Here, we need all 5 out of 5 people to agree with the solution. We need everyone to absolutely agree. Otherwise, we don't have a solution. We will also revisit this in a second. Okay, so before we get to those things, I do want to talk then about work team effectiveness. So here with work team effectiveness, we can look at the impact then on team decision making on whether the teams are performing well. So we can look at various different outcomes. We can look at team performance. So is the team doing what they are supposed to do? Are they performing the tasks that we are expected of them? Or are they performing the tasks that are expected of them? Then we have attitudes. Is the team satisfied with each other and the work that they do? And then withdrawal. Is the team experiencing high levels of turnover? Are people staying? Are they attending their work? Are they absent? Are they late, etc.? And I want to expand here really quickly on this concept of team performance as well as withdrawal and just make a couple of notes before we move on. First, we can think of work or group team performance in terms of task work and teamwork. Is the group doing the tasks required of them, which I discussed in the previous slide? So are they actually doing the jobs that we brought the group together to do? And then teamwork. Are they doing the things as a team that they need to do to get those tasks done? So are they cooperating? Are they coordinating? Are they communicating? All of those processes that are critical for a team to do their work. Another way that we can look at team performance are these group level behaviors. So here we can sometimes think of are each individual team or is each individual team member doing what they're supposed to do? But we can also think about performance in terms of a collective, in terms of the group actually working together and working as a whole unit to get something done as opposed to them dispersing and doing things on their own and pooling their results effectively. One important thing to note here, and I will just reiterate again, is that norms are really important in influencing performance. Remember, I mentioned that when you have a group norm, that may influence performance far more than any motivational factor that will take place. Indeed, that's what we saw in the Hawthorne studies, that experimenters introduced different motivators in that case, in certain cases, differences in lighting, and it didn't impact performance because the group had a norm of high performance that wasn't going to be influenced by things like lighting and other factors that came into play. So we know that the group norms and standards can influence the extent to which the group will perform the tasks expected of them. One other interesting thing about group behaviors is that the context of being in a group can also influence the way that individuals behave. For example, research shows that being in a group can actually lead to more deviant behaviors. The same process that explains this is the same process that explains social loafing, namely that when you have a larger group of people, the ability of outsiders to pinpoint who is responsible for something becomes more difficult. For example, I once did an experiment with a group of people, or people would come to a lab in groups, and we would leave a bowl of candy with a sign that said, please only take one, and we would measure how much candy remained. What was interesting is that ultimately we could never really actually pinpoint who took more candy than or who took more candy. If three pieces of candy were missing and three people walked in, we could assume that everybody took one piece of candy, or we could reasonably assume that one person took three pieces of candy, and we never would have known. So this points out something about a group context is that it's easier to basically get away with deviant behaviors and things like theft and waste of resources because in a group context because it's more difficult to pinpoint who did it than if one person walks into a room and three pieces of candy are missing when they leave. We can also find that groups can engage in OCBs as a collective, so as an entire unit. So groups can engage in helping behaviors. They can, as a group, help other people or help other groups as well. We can also try to understand things like withdrawal, so in turnover, in terms of a collective sense. So looking at, is the group going to leave an organization, or what number of members of the group are going to leave at the end of a project, or maybe even in the middle of the project. Another thing that can influence team decision making is the composition of the team. We spoke about this in the first video about team composition in terms of homogeneity and heterogeneity. And we're going to revisit it from a little bit of a different lens that's more consistent with the way that the textbook has talked about some things related to team composition as well. So when we're looking at team composition, we can look at things like the abilities of members and how that impacts decision making and therefore performance. Research does show that average cognitive ability does predict team performance, much like in the way that at the individual level, we see that high levels of cognitive ability lead to better performance. We also see at the group level that high average levels of cognitive ability among group members tends to lead to better performance. In short, the smarter the members of the group, the better their performance. And this is not surprising at all. Indeed, what a lot of research has shown is that even if you have one single weak link, that can negatively impact the ability of the group to perform well. Personality is also really critical to a team's success and their ability to make good decisions. Research shows that, once again, not surprisingly, higher levels among group members of conscientiousness, agreeableness, and emotional stability are good for group performance. And in fact, just having just one person who is low on agreeableness, conscientiousness, or extroversion can limit this. In short, having one bad apple can spoil the whole bunch. So you have to be wary of when you are selecting people for a team to make sure that they're all strong on cognitive ability and to make sure that they have high levels on average of conscientiousness, agreeableness, and emotional stability. And that you don't want to compromise by having someone who's low on agreeableness, conscientiousness, or extroversion, because that can really spoil the potential of the rest of the team to perform well. When we're looking at team composition, we also want to consider the allocation of roles. We talked about roles previously, so I won't reiterate what that means. But we want to make sure that when we give roles to people, for example, a leadership role or an organizer role, a secretary type role, you want to make sure that the person has the appropriate amount of experience for that role. So does it make sense, for example, to give a leadership position to someone who has no experience being a leader? You also want to make sure that if you give someone the role of being an organizer or secretary or more of a group manager as opposed to leader, you want to make sure that that person has the skills and the abilities and the experience to do that work. Researchers have also looked at the perception of roles. So we've looked at the team role test to help us understand whether team members know which roles their fellow team members occupy, and whether they understand what those roles entail. I think we will revisit this when we talk about mental models as well, because this represents actually a type of a mental model. But researchers have also expanded upon team understanding of roles as well as their orientation to different roles and developed the TREO, or Team Role Experience and Orientation Measure. This gets at people's orientations, their past behaviors, and their dispositions and knowledge toward different roles and toward working in the team. Oops. The book notes, and I think this is a really critical thing to consider, that when we are composing a team, so when we are putting a team together, we do need to be cognizant of whether our team members have the personality as well as preferences for teamwork. In terms of personality, for example, it does not make a lot of sense to put someone on a team that's maybe low in extroversion, right? People who are introverts tend not to like being around other people, or rather, it can be very draining for them emotionally. They prefer to work in either small groups with close friends or work alone. And so, in that way, we also need to be aware of member preferences. Even certain extroverted people do not like group work. I am an extrovert and I hated group work in college because, as a relatively intelligent extrovert, I often experienced a lot of free riding and therefore hated working in groups because I always ended up doing a ton of the work. And I'm sure a lot of you in this class can understand that experience. So when we are working in organizations, we do need to be aware that not everybody that we put in a team is going to want to be on a team. And in fact, paying attention to who prefers to work on teams and who doesn't can help those teams perform better. In fact, you probably should put people on teams who want to work on teams. This is why, in my opinion, the premise of the movie, The Avengers, makes no sense because Captain America, Iron Man, and Thor all don't like working on a team. If I were Nick Fury, I'd try to look for people who actually wanted to be involved in a world-saving initiative of superheroes, as opposed to people who prefer a more lone wolf approach. And this is the thing about being a manager and being a supervisor in an organization, is you need to understand that teamwork is not going to work well for everyone. Some people will do a lot better just working on their own. And I think we'll talk about capitalizing on group decision making in a bit, but we do need to understand that some people will do better if you just let them work by themselves. I mentioned earlier mental models, so let's talk about mental models before we move on. So when we bring together, it's critical that they have a similar understanding of things that they will interact with and work with. Now, I'm not just talking about tangible physical things, like do we all have the same understanding of what this tablet is? Do we all have the same understanding of what technology we work with? Or do we have the same understanding of the technology that we work with? Rather, usually when we're talking about mental models, we're talking about a cognitive or mental representation of something not so tangible. Things like an understanding of the task that you're working on. Do you all share the same mental model, so cognitive mental understanding of the task that you are doing, the process that you are going to use? Another mental model that people talk about in IO psychology is transactive memory. Do all of the group members within a group understand each other's roles and who occupies those, or rather, sorry, do they all understand each other's knowledge and who possesses that knowledge? Because it's critical for you to know, in order to work well as a team, who knows what, and then also maybe who among your team knows who knows what. So if I need to get something done that's related to statistical analyses, and this often happens in academia when we put teams together, you have someone who's really good at writing, someone who's good at collecting data, someone who's good at analyzing it. For me, when I work on those teams, it's important to understand who is my stats person, who is my writing person, who is my data collection person. Without that understanding, teams don't work very well because you spend a lot of time wasted trying to figure out who knows what and who do I need to talk to right now. So having mental models can enhance performance and ensure that a team or group is on the same page about what they are doing. Now let's talk about individual versus team performance. One way to start this conversation is by talking about process loss. Process loss occurs when there is any non-motivational aspect of a group that minimizes or inhibits a group's ability to perform. That's pretty similar to how the book identifies it. So basically, What happens when you bring a group together that can minimize the extent to which each of those individuals, or rather can minimize what would have been the pooled performance of all of those individuals put together? So if I were to let 3 people tackle a particular problem on their own, what would that performance have been compared to what is their performance when I put all 3 of those people into a group? Because inevitably, when you put people, well, not inevitably, but when you put people together, you can experience process loss. This law of group performance, that when you bring people together, you are going to see some potential decreases in the performance of that group relative to what you would have observed if those 3 people had been left to their own devices. Now, the law of group performance, it is basically this equation right here, which is what is your actual productivity? And that is equal to the potential productivity minus the losses due to faulty processes. In this case, the losses due to bringing people together in a group. So you could, for example, though, have actual productivity is equal to potential productivity because there are very little or no losses due to faulty processes. However, if bringing a group together really inhibits the ability of that group to work well and to get things done, then the potential productivity minus these high losses leads to very low productivity in reality. As such, we really need to be aware of the extent to which bringing people together in a group may result in losses, may result in decreased performance. So this brings us to just a more general discussion of group decision making. Compared to an individual, group decision making does have some benefits. This is why we bring people together in groups in the first place. One of these benefits is that when we bring people together, and this relates to diversity in the first video that I posted, we have multiple perspectives, which means we also have more information and more knowledge. Because if I work by myself, the only perspective I have is my own. Maybe I will seek advice, but usually our advice-seeking networks are very similar to us. So we don't really actually get a lot of different opinions or perspectives. When we are working in a group or a team, however, we do get different perspectives, and therefore maybe better optimization of the solutions to the problems that we are dealing with. When you work in a group, you actually get more acceptance of a solution, because if someone comes up with a solution on their own and by themselves, it seems like a unilateral decision that people are not comfortable with. However, if people feel like they were a part of the solution as a group member, then they are more willing to accept it because they feel ownership over that solution. Group decisions are also more creative. This relates to this idea of multiple perspectives, that when you bring in different viewpoints, you do get more creativity. And because you have multiple different sources of knowledge, your decisions then tend to be more accurate. You're not relying on a single source of information, rather you're relying on multiple complementary sources of information that can optimize your decision making and make it more accurate. But there are downsides. Remember, we talked about how groups desire conformity. We want to conform to our groups. We want to conform to the norms and standards because we want to retain membership in groups, especially those that are very desirable to be a part of and very high status. When we bring people together in groups too, we may end up with such high levels of homogeneity, so similarity among group members, that we actually don't get diverse perspectives. We don't get different sources of knowledge. If I put together a bunch of white women who graduated with psychology degrees from the University of Akron in 2018, who went on to pursue HR in the greater Cleveland-Akron area, who all were part of the same sorority and all played intramural soccer, there's going to be a lot of homogeneity among that group of people. And they probably won't have as diverse perspectives if I drew from a whole pool of various different talent. So if you put a group together, you need to be aware of whether you are actually bringing in enough diversity, enough psychological differences, enough differences in knowledge and information that you could actually get good decision making from that group. Another issue with group decision making is who is responsible. This is why we have social loafing, because when you put a group together, it's unclear who is responsible. The responsibility is shared. And because of that, when things go wrong, it's actually really hard to decide who to blame or who is accountable, who needs to understand what they did wrong and learn from it. The other hard part about group decision making is it's not very efficient, right? We all know how much easier it is to just make a decision on our own as opposed to consult multiple people or multiple parties. So in that way, we can experience, per this previous slide, some process loss when we bring groups together compared to if we had just let individuals work on their own. When we bring groups together too, we bring them together with the understanding that they would share information, right? That when we bring in people with these different information sources, that they would actually, put it all on the table. But do groups actually capitalize on their groupiness, if you will? Well, it really depends, right? We do find that groups sometimes don't pool their information. Their pooled shared information is pales in comparison to the unshared information. So if your group isn't actually bringing to light all of their different perspectives, then we may once again not see the benefits of group dynamics that we would hope for as managers and as members of an organization. So when we basically, and to note and to make it very clear, when we have unshared information, so when people aren't sharing information, research shows that it can inhibit a group's performance. But it happens that people don't often share information or different perspectives. Now, why might that be? Well, one thing that happens when we bring group members together is something known as polarization. Group polarization refers to when the opinions of group members become more extreme through discussion than the original average that we showed. So let's go back to that deciding who to lay off example. And let's say, as I said, that we have one person who wants 100 people laid off, one person who wants 300, and one person who wants 500. We may note then that on average, those people want 300 people to be laid off. And then if we put them in a group together, we may find that when they leave that group discussion about how many people should be laid off, that we would see people recommending instead numbers closer to 400 or 500. And this is because group opinions, as I mentioned earlier, become more extreme through discussion. Now, why might this be? This might be because when we bring people together and they start discussing their different opinions and they hear that other people possess more extreme opinions, they become more comfortable with making their opinions and their ideas more extreme. So it's some level of conformity, some level of making you feel more comfortable with your own initial inclinations. So someone who maybe came in saying they wanted to lay off 300 people, hears someone else say 500 and they say, well, if that person's saying 500, then I'm totally fine bumping it up to 400. So we become more comfortable with greater extremes when we are discussing those opinions with other people who are of relatively similar opinion as well. When we are also in a group, though, we see a diffusion of responsibility so that so back to this idea that we don't know who's responsible. When we are in a group, it therefore leads us to, let me rephrase. Because we can't really identify and highlight who is responsible for something in a group, especially when it goes wrong, people are more comfortable with extremes because if it does go wrong, no one's going to blame them, right? So if someone says, hey, why not just fire 600 people? No one's going to know that, no one's going to come for me after this. If that goes wrong, then that person's perspective may be right, that if people have blowback or if the organization experiences blowback for firing so many people, you may find that it's very difficult to pinpoint who was behind it all. And in that way, once again, people can become more comfortable with extremes because no one is going to blame them, or it's going to be much harder to blame them if those extremes end up getting them in trouble. When we also have groups, we see that something known as groupthink emerges. Let me move my little talking head. So with groupthink, we have unanimity coming first. So that means people basically emphasize consensus, agreement over everything else. Because they're focusing so much on agreement, they don't actually optimize ideal solutions. You're so focused on, okay, can we just come to an agreement, that you don't think about what is actually the best solution. Because research shows that the solution that everybody agrees on isn't often the best one for a particular problem. Now, when does groupthink become more likely to occur? Well, ironically, when there are high levels of cohesion. This is the one case where cohesion is not so good for groups, is that it leads to groupthink. It leads to us prioritizing agreement and consensus over identifying a good solution to a problem. We also find that when you have a group leader who is promoting their opinion very strongly, that leads to a lot of groupthink because people just want to please the leader. When groups are also insulated from contrary ideas, so they're not really listening to other people or other groups, that can also lead to groupthink because they aren't entertaining other ideas. Once again, they're just focused on agreeing. And if there's a time pressure, we can also see a lot of groupthink. And this makes sense, right? How many of us have been under time pressure to come up with a decision in a group context? And you just say, can we just find something that everybody agrees on so we can get to the deadline, right? So these conditions can lead to greater groupthink. And this is really important for you as future managers to understand so you can limit the extent to which the conditions you're putting your groups in will lead to groupthink. Now, what does groupthink result in? A lot of not good things. Obviously, you don't optimize the solution for a group's problem. You also find that groups have this illusion of invulnerability. They think that because everybody within their group agreed, that there's nothing that could possibly go wrong within when it comes to implementing their solution. They often discount warnings. So if ever they see that their solution might not be ideal, they start to discount it or ignore it. They have an unquestioned belief in their moral superiority and the rightness of what they've done because everybody within the group agreed. They also tend to pressure group members to agree with their perspective. So there's a lot of silencing that goes on. And there is effectively this shared illusion of unanimity. Some research has even shown that when groupthink occurs, that you can find groups where they come to a decision that when you asked everybody to later then say, well, do you like that decision? Do you like that choice? They all would say no. So sometimes you find groups coming up with a solution that no one is actually on board with, but they all believe that everybody else was on board with it. So they all agreed with it. So in that way, it can be insanely problematic to rely on groups, especially if they are under these conditions. Now, of course, groups can be a really beneficial place to leverage different perspectives. But if people are focused so much on agreement that they're ignoring those different perspectives, well, then you're going to have a problem. So how can we limit groupthink? How do you avoid it? How can you as a manager limit it? Well, you can minimize those conditions I mentioned earlier. But if you keep groups small, that can minimize groupthink. Make sure your leaders are impartial so they aren't promoting their own ideas or their own perspectives, and rather they are facilitators of conversation. And appoint a devil's advocate. Remember, going back to our discussion of conflict, appointing someone to actually be the contrarian, to be constantly challenging people, can limit the extent to which they're engaging in groupthink. So what is the conclusion here? Overall, be careful when using groups. Groups can be a really great place to get organizational work done, but they have a lot of downsides: groupthink, group polarization, conflict. And so in that way, we need to be careful. Sometimes putting an individual on a particular task may be more beneficial than putting a group on it. You may find yourself experiencing process loss. So though a lot of organizations today will say that teamwork is the future and teamwork is what we should be focusing on and doing, we really need to be careful and diligent to make sure that we aren't falling into the same issues and errors that we've talked about in this lecture. Thank you all for listening to this, and I will see you all on Thursday.